right, this is February the 9th, 1994, and we're in Greeley, Colorado at the Don Cockroft home, trying to glean some memories from the Ivan Cockroft side of the house. He has 3 of his children here that are going to be sharing some of their memories of their parents and maybe even grandparents and then their own lives. So I believe we're going to start off with Don giving us some background.
Okay, I'm Don Cockroft, son of Ivan. In Ivan's family there was my sister Evelyn, who was the oldest, and then there was my brother Bill, who lives in Mesa, Arizona, and next was myself, and then came my brother Dean, and then the twin brothers that live at Delta, and they, of course, are not here with us today, but Evelyn and Dean and myself will try to elaborate a little bit on the Ivan Cockroft family and some of the memories and so forth of the past. So my sister Evelyn will bring us up to date on who Ivan Cockroft is, who Joe Cockroft is, and how Ivan fit into that family.
Actually, the Cockroft history begins in England, in Yorkshire, England, and it seems like the Cockrofts had lived there a long, long, long time, but our story picks up in the 1840s, because we're not just sure why, but evidently there were land developers from Wisconsin who were in England at that period of time, and were advertising land in Wisconsin. And many of the Cockroft families who lived in Huddersfield, it was a city area, and their friends were tired of living in Huddersfield. It was becoming a large city then, and they were working in cloth factories, and they weren't very happy with that situation. So Wisconsin sounded very good. Out of that group, Joseph Cockroft and his son William John Cockroft went with a group of other men, and they came to Wisconsin to spy out the land, so to speak, it seemed like. And it appealed to them, and so a lot more of the Cockroft families, the Gooder families, a great many more people from that Huddersfield area came. And they established something they have always called an English settlement that's near Rochester, Wisconsin, actually Burlington, Wisconsin. It's a rural area. And they all it was before the time of homesteads, but they bought land cheap and they set up farming. And I think I mentioned once before to some of you at a family reunion that they didn't know much about farming because they had lived in Huddersfield and had been working in cloth factories and so forth. So they had to learn in very difficult ways how to farm. That they had thought first that you could just you could raise little corn plants and wheat plants and then take them out and transplant them. And they had an awful time. But they finally learned to be pretty good farmers there. Now that was the 1840s and 1850s. But I think in the areas of our country, they were always searching for better land. It seemed like that to me. So then I've told you that Joseph Cockroft was the immigrant ancestor, and then there was William John. His son was Walter. Now Walter is our grandpa's father. And Walter was born in Wisconsin, but his mother took him back to England because she gave up on the new country and went back to England to live. But when he was about 19, his father, William John, brought him back to America. And then that's when he met Sarah Gooder, and Sarah and Walter were married in, I think it's 1868. So you kind of get that period of time through in there. And our Grandpa Joe, was born in Wisconsin in 1869. And when he was just a little child, in 1871 or 2, in fact, that's when his parents and some more Gooder families came to Joe County, Kansas. And we're not sure just what brought them there, but they came. Sometimes I think it just was a search of land. What do you think? I don't know.
It wasn't a land grant?
No, there was not. And they're not really homesteads.
Oh.
Some of them may have had homesteads, but they're not really. They just evidently were able to pick up land fairly economical. And so then after they came to Kansas and were living in Joe County, you see, Grandpa was just a tiny child. Well, then the rest of them were born. Who are the rest of the Cockrofts? It's Uncle Fred and...
Uncle Fred and Uncle Lawrence. And,
yes, and Aunt Mary.
Lewis. And,
no, not Lewis.
No, Lewis was Patna. Is that
Yeah,
right?
but anyway, the rest of the family were born, and they lived there. It was Grandpa was called an Old Salem. They lived near, but actually it was
Aunt Mary was
yeah, she was one of them. She was the only daughter, actually,
only daughter.
Aunt Mary, and they lived there in that area and near Old Salem. Grandpa was said. Now, if you went back there now, Old Salem's not there anymore. It's just a rural area. But one time, Grandpa went with us and showed us when we were living down in Jewell County. Just, you couldn't really see much, but that's where he grew up, and then, you see, the Patnodes were there. Because the Patnodes came from Illinois in the 1870s as well. And Grandma had been born in Illinois, so you have them coming together in Jewell County, but neither of them had been born in Jewell County. Grandpa in Wisconsin and Grandma in Illinois. And Grandma and Uncle Alec and one of the girls, Aunt Ellen, were the only three that were in the Patnode family when they moved to Jewell County. So then all that long of 10 children, isn't it, that the Patnodes had? I think. That many were
Uncle Bud was born in
Jewell County.
Jewell County. Grandma Matilda and then Aunt Ida and
All them were
there.
born in Jewell County. The only ones born in Illinois were Grandma
Uncle Pat
and Uncle Pat and Aunt Evelyn. Those were the only three born in Illinois.
I remember when I was a kid going down to visit.
Yeah, I think we need to think about how important the Patnodes were in our family, actually.
When I was a kid, we went down to visit. You always often wondered where did we get started eating so much popcorn?
Yeah.
Well, that's where it come from, because when I was a kid, we went down to visit Grandma and Grandpa Patnode, and Aunt Till and Aunt Lil. Of course, Uncle Pat was home at that time. And they always had a bushel basket full of popcorn to eat.
See, I'm glad
So
you remembered
that's where that
that.
all come from. Now, Uncle Patty smoked a pipe. So Grandma Patnode didn't want him smoking in the house, so Uncle Pat kept his pipe down in the barn by the buggy. So when we as kids, we'd sneak down there and look up Uncle Pat's pipe and pretend we were smoking his pipe, see? But Grandma Patnode wouldn't let him keep
Well,
that.
let me tell you who she did let smoke a pipe. I remember Grandpa Patnode. He died in 1927, and he smoked a pipe right in the house. Oh yes, and they waited on him. Plus, then he had a spittoon and spit in a spittoon.
I
remember that.
You remember Grandpa Patnode?
Uncle Pat.
Well, Uncle
smoked
Pat
a
had a
pipe.
spittoon around too, around the corner somewhere.
And
But anyway, that's when how the Patnodes and Cockrofts got together. They lived evidently not too many miles apart.
well, how far down the line was Uncle Mud?
Well, I don't know for sure where he fit in. Don's got a picture here. The oldest, I'm telling you, were, my grandma was the oldest in the family. And then I'd have to have my paper to remember them all. But then came, I believe, Uncle Pat, and then Aunt Ellen. Then I think pretty soon after that was Aunt Ide. Let me see who else is there. Probably Aunt.
Grandpa and
Melinda.
and Grandpa's brother Fred.
Yeah, yes, see, they all lived there in Jewell County, and Grandma Melinda married Joe Cockroft, and Aunt Ide married, and by the way, you know Aunt Ide's name was Hattie Mary? Oh, I kept all this time trying to figure out. She was always called Aunt Ide. I don't know why.
You know, you was talking about Uncle Fred. I remember Uncle Fred had walked with a cane and a limp. Well, a horse got him in a stall and hurt his hip or something, wasn't it? And then
I don't
then
know
on
that
he was
part. You mean
crippled.
that's why he was crippled?
Yeah, he
I
was
don't
crippled,
know.
and he shuffled around on it with a cane.
But see, Grandpa and Grandma were also married first. Not only were they the oldest in their families, but they were married first. Now, it couldn't have been too much before Uncle Fred and Aunt Ide, but they were married first. And then the younger ones, then like we said, was Uncle Mutt. He must have come along in there. Aunt Ellen was married maybe first. But anyway, Aunt Ellen and Grandma and them were married. They were the older ones.
Aunt Ellen is the one that lived in California,
Yeah.
Pasadena.
Right.
Because when I was in the service, I went up and visited her.
Oh, you did?
Yeah, Bill and I both went up.
I saw Aunt Ellen.
Aunt Ellen.
She lived in the Los Angeles area, didn't she?
And stayed one night. visited with her, and I think that's probably the last time I.
Well, on the back
Remember that,
here, Donna or Nancy or somebody's written, and it does see Grandma, I know, is the oldest, 1872, she was born. Then Uncle Pat, and his name was Louis Alexander, you know. It wasn't Uncle Pat,
Just,
really.
You can set it on the table.
Yeah, I
and then
don't
just point.
remember too much about Aunt Ellen's family, but I know she sure had some good-looking grandkids or whatever.
Well, she used to come back.
That's fine. Just set it on the table.
I
And then
remember- do you
with your
remember when we
pencil
lived on
point to
Ash-
which
Ash
ones are
Mason,
while they're
they come
sitting
over
on the
and visit
table.
Okay.
Well, now let's see if I can see.
The Grandpa Patno. Point out Grandpa and Grandma Patno.
I can't
Pull
even
it back
see
closer
from
to
here.
you.
Maybe.
There, that'll go.
Now I can see where they are. This is Grandpa Patnode and Grandma Patnode.
Mm-hmm.
And along with the Patnodes, when they came to Kansas, several of her sisters came. So that you begin to have quite a few of the old ladies around in that country, too. And some of you may have heard of them. And then here's Grandma, Melinda.
That's our grandmother.
Yeah, right.
Mm-hmm.
And some of these look so different because it was taken so long ago.
So yeah.
Well, let's
I
just
can't have to tell which is which. I think that's Aunt Ellen, and this is Aunt Ide. It doesn't look like Aunt Ide no more than anything, does it? That's Uncle Pat. That's Aunt Till. This is Aunt Lil, that little girl, and there's Uncle Steve.
Mm-hmm. Good.
Uncle
Okay.
Steve, you see, is what was the youngest boy, and then Aunt Till and Aunt Lil were the youngest girls. Uncle Steve was only 10 years older than our dad.
the reason we're bringing out the part of the Patnodes is because two of the Cockrofts, Joe Cockroft, my grandfather, and Fred Cockroft, his brother, married two sisters of the Patnodes, Melinda, my grandmother, and Ida, the other girl. So what that does for us is it makes us all double cousins, and pretty closely related. So that's the reason that we wanted to show the Patnode picture. If you'll note there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 children, and they had, I think, something like
Well, there's
12 or 15, and they lost 2 sets of twins. didn't
well, except that Aunt Lil was one of a set of twins, and she survived. They lost another set of twins.
they? Okay,
Yes,
let's
that's right.
leave it there now.
Yeah.
That's all people that was down in Jewell County, Kansas. Now, the next is Joe Cockroft family, and this is Walter, who's the father of Joe and Fred, and this is Fred Cockroft here. This is Joe's wife, Walter's wife, and Aunt Mary, the lady we call Aunt Mary, and this is Fred Cockroft. This is Uncle Louis Cockroft.
No,
or
Uncle
Lawrence-
Willie.
Willie?
Uncle
All right,
Willie.
Uncle Willie. Here's our grandfather, Joe. So this picture, pretty much we wanted to show to bring out the part of Joe. Now,
He
is
was
this
which
Aunt Lou-
member?
Louis?
What position in the family was Joe?
He was the oldest. You remember,
He's
he's
the
the only
firstborn.
one born in
Down here,
Wisconsin.
picture
That's
there,
right.
Right
okay.
there.
Okay, now here is a picture of Joe all by himself, as he is a young man.
They say this is the picture he had taken to give to Grandma
All right.
before he married her.
Could I tell you a story about Grandpa Cockroft?
Yes, you can.
I want to tell you a story about Grandpa Cockroft when he was a young man, and they moved up there to Jewell County. Now, the reason I remember this story, I remember when we were kids and we used to go over to Grandpa's and Grandma's, and of course we always had those big milk cookies Grandma made, and then Grandpa used to sit around and tell stories.
Yeah, he probably would.
Well, at one time in his life, Grandpa Cockroft was a bonded slave.
Oh, no, that part I don't remember.
And what he did, when they first moved, or whenever it was that they moved, his father had borrowed,
Oh, he was indentured, you mean?
indentured,
Yeah.
but it was the same as a bonded. But anyway, he had to go, his father had borrowed, or evidently had this storekeeper something for his seed and stuff for
Well,
the
that
farm.
could be.
And when he at the end of the year, he had a bad crop or something, Grandpa had to go work for him for a couple of years.
Well, that could
And I
be.
remember Grandpa saying about all he had in this room was just a cot and stuff. And
They had a hard time, you know.
he
Aunt
worked,
Gladys's
he worked it off until he worked off the debt, and then of course they released
Well,
him.
you know, Walter had an awful time himself. in England. Do you remember they
So
tell the
I
story?
remember that story. Grandpa told us that
I don't
story.
remember that, but that's a good story to share.
You
and
know,
it
I
makes sense.
I told that to Uncle Glenn one time. He says, "Is that right, son?" He says, "I don't remember that." And I said,
Good,
"Well,"
good you did.
I said, "Well, Unc," I said, "You know, when we used to go over there and he'd tell us these stories, we always went over and stayed with him a lot. And of course, Grandma always had the big cookie jar churned full of cookies."
She would bake those great big pans of cookies and turn them out on her bed, on newspapers.
Right.
And then when they cooled, she'd pick them all up and she had a place to keep them. But I remember a bed covered with these great big cookies.
Great.
Isn't that something?
But hey, Grandpa also, he followed around when he was young, followed broom corn thrash machine.
Well, yeah, he might have.
And what he did, they thrashed it, and then they took those stalks or whatever it is, you know, on the end, made brooms out of them. Well, of course, that's the reason they called it broom corn. But Grandpa used to do that a lot, and he said they'd work from sun up till sundown. At night, they just crawl right in the old stag, slept, got up the next morning, went right back at her.
Was that when they were in Jewell County, or?
Well, I think
Oh,
so.
yes, because see, he grew up in
It's
Jewell
when he
County.
was a young man before he got married.
You know, they were really poor. Aunt Gladys told about that Grandma Patton, or not Grandma Patton, no, Grandma Cockroft, Sarah, worked out even to try to make 50 cents a day so they'd get enough to live on. And that makes sense about what Dina's telling about Walter not having any money and all that.
Well, I don't remember. You probably have it. But I can remember seeing some of those when they got older, and their pension was only like $6.50 a month.
Well,
or
yeah,
something
they
like
didn't
that.
get very much. They were
I mean, it
poor.
wasn't nothing. Of course, it went quite a ways in those
You know,
days.
in looking at all these, I always thought Grandpa was the best looking.
That's
What
right.
do you think?
Well, I think so. If he was our grandpa, he had to be the best.
Well, he
looking.
is. Look at that.
I just thought he was the best looking.
He's really dressed up, boy. Looky there.
Do you know how he and grandmother met?
Not exactly, no. I just know they lived, you know, in the same area, and that's all I know about it. Unless somebody else knows the story, I don't know
Well, I
how
don't
they
know
did.
that. I don't think even Evelyn mentioned
No,
that
I
they
don't think
met
she
and
did
were
either.
married.
They all lived there, you know, in
In
the
Jewell
same.
County, Borough area of Jewell County, and I think evidently they live fairly close to the Patnodes.
Yes, not too many miles. I
And,
told you around Old Salem and Lebanon.
Yeah,
Those
and
aren't
that
very
was
many
all
miles.
around Burr and Lebanon and Salem were all fairly close. I'd say within probably a 10-mile radius of where they actually lived there.
Well, you know. Go ahead.
With her being Catholic, do you think they were married in the Catholic Church?
No.
Okay, do you know about that?
I don't know exactly when all of them left it, but see, Grandpa and Grandma were married back where? In 1994, didn't I tell you that? Anyway, I think they were. And that's actually before a lot of them became Christians. I tried to talk to Dad once about Uncle Steve. If you want to know, Uncle Steve had the biggest influence on the family
From
as
the
far as a Christian.
Protestant side.
But Dad told me he didn't think Uncle Steve really became a Christian too much till about 1915. There were evangelists that came through that area, though. And Grandpa Walter and Sarah both says in both their obituaries that they were converted under United Brethren preachers.
Oh.
Now, I think those influences were around, and so I never knew exactly why the Patnodes were willing that, you know, their family wasn't going Catholic ways. Because they evidently were very open to that, and I'm not sure why.
Something happened to Uncle Steve in Uncle Steve's life that he lost faith in the Catholic religion, and he became a Protestant.
Well, there were evangelists. It says in Aunt Stella's obituary that there were evangelists that came through the country, and that they both had a real conversion experience around, well, my dad thought, around 1915. But you can see, Grandpa and Grandma were married before that. So there must have been other influences as well that were going on, but exactly what they all were. But you know, actually, I've thought about it. Grandma, even as children, and when we went to visit the Patnodes, I never felt she had any animosity about people not being Catholic.
That's right.
Isn't that wonderful?
I thought it was. I never felt that in her or in
That
Aunt
was
Jill or
Grandma
Aunt Lil.
Patnode?
Grandma Pat.
They were very strict Catholics. Grandma and Grandpa Patnode and Aunt Till and Aunt Lil were very strict Catholics.
Is
Well,
that
now-
from
now-
their French Canadian
from their
upbringing.
Canadian background. And you see, the O'Learys were Canadian French, as were the Patnodes, and they had all been brought up all strict Catholics.
The O'Learys was the Grandma Patnode side.
Yes, they were, but they were all brought up strict Catholics. And when they were there in Jewell County, they seem to have had an openness that I don't understand.
Well, you know that Uncle Mutt, he kind of stayed with the Catholic faith, didn't he?
Well, not too well.
Not too much, but anyway, now Aunt Lena, I remember, Aunt Lena being, that was Uncle Mutt's wife. She come to the Nazarene
Why,
Church.
Uncle
in
Mutt
Delta.
was a Nazarene too.
Oh, was he?
Oh, yes,
Oh, I
he
didn't
was.
know
He might have
that.
been one a very good one, Dean. I don't know about that, but
I thought he, because when he passed away, he left a lot of his stuff to the Catholic Church.
well, he left it only because of Aunt
To
Till and
that
Aunt
Till
Lil.
Lil.
Yeah.
Take care of them.
Yeah, that was why. Not because he's interested in Catholics, but
No,
he's
he
interested in Aunt Till and Aunt Lil.
Now, Uncle Mutt, as we're talking about Uncle Mutt, was a member of this Patnode family, and
Grandma's brother.
and it'd be our grandmother's brother, and he came to Colorado from Kansas, I suppose.
You know,
what?
Well, it was way back when they were first married.
That'd be what?
About 1925, probably, when he came to Colorado, and he located over here at Eckley, and then he moved on over to Delta
Do
area.
you know what brought him out west further?
Well, you want me to tell you?
If you
Right,
know.
you tell her that.
Grandpa Patnode had a sister who lived over in the Montrose area.
Oh.
What are those people's names?
Lived up on the Cimarron.
Yes, and had ram
Veal.
cattle. Veals.
Dutch veal.
It's
And
the
what
Veals that brought
relation were
Uncle.
they?
Well, Mrs.
Cousins.
Veal was a sister to Grandpa Patnode. The oldest lady Veal was a sister. Her name was Drusilla Veal, and she had been Drusilla Patnode. And that's how Uncle Mutt got out there. They were on the Cimarron, and they were even on the Cimarron. There's some of them still on the Cimarron over there, of those
They had quite
Veals.
a ranch
Oh,
up
good.
over
I'd
there.
never heard that.
Who
You
was
know,
it?
yeah.
Don Dutch Veal used to live right down there, pretty close to Uncle Mutt.
Why, do you remember how Glenn used to drive his car and go rip-roaring
Yeah.
up those hills to visit them? They used to tell about that.
They were quite a family, the Veals.
Oh, yes,
They
they
had
were.
quite a reputation up in that country.
Yeah, they did. And I've met some of their relatives in more recent times.
Now, what relation did you say they were?
Well, the old Grandma Veal was a sister to Grandpa Patnode.
Oh,
And there was a
okay.
period of time when Grandpa Patnode took Aunt Till and Aunt Lil and went and visited those Veals himself before he died. I think 2 or 3 years before he died, he took Aunt Till and Aunt Lil and went up there at that Cimarron country and visited them. She's buried in Montrose, but she was a strong Catholic too.
They'd be second or third cousins.
Oh, yes, nowadays. It's
Yeah, I
way
remember
down. But that's how Uncle Mutt got over in that country.
of us, really.
Now
And Don was saying about our connections to the Patnodes, but I'm telling you, Uncle Mutt had a big influence too, because that's why Albert and Dad and Bob and them went to Western Colorado. Was through Uncle Mutt.
Well, Bob and Albert were sons of Ida
Fred.
and Fred.
Yeah. So we're still back on the Patnodes, but that had something to do about it. You know, Grandpa and Grandma Cockroft, Melinda and Joe, were living there in Jewell County after they were married, and they just seemed to live in different farms. You know how Aunt Lena told about, I think in hers, about Grandma not liking a sod house and being glad they didn't have a sod house out in Phillips County. Well, in Aunt Gladys's writing, she says there was a period of time when they lived in a sod house in Jewell County. And that's the stories that Grandma really told. It wasn't just something she'd heard, but they actually lived in a sod house for a while in Jewell County. And I think maybe Aunt Lena was born in that sod house.
Yes, she was born in
Yeah.
Jewell County. I
Well,
remember
all
her
three
saying.
of them. My dad was
That's
born
true.
in Jewell County in 1895, and Aunt Gladys in 1898, and Aunt Lena in 1900, and Aunt Littlest in 1902. Well, then in Aunt Gladys's writing, she says that Grandpa and Uncle Steve came to Phillips County to look for land,
Oh.
and that they did that in 1904, and that they found this piece of land that they later had. Now, there's some talk about did they homestead that, but I was telling Don that my dad said, no, they didn't homestead it. There had been a first owner, and then they bought it from him. But Aunt Gladys said they homesteaded it, so there seems to be a little confusion about it, but I don't think it was a homestead.
That first owner hadn't been there very long,
No.
maybe.
And it had not been cared for very well, and evidently he got it at a good price. There were no buildings on
I
it.
wondered if there were any structures.
No, there weren't. And Aunt Gladys wrote about that a whole lot of it had big grass there on that land.
Oh.
And they had a lot of, that they had to burn grass and use the sod plow to get some fields ready to farm. But anyway, in 1904, Grandpa and Uncle Steve found this land. Then in spring of 19...
Came to Phillips County then.
Yeah, came to Phillips County, out there in northern Phillips County, and found that land. And then they moved the family in the spring of 1905.
Mm-hmm.
And Aunt Gladys tells about that they moved in wagons and herded their cattle along, and that it took 3 days because they ran into a rainstorm and had to
What
stay
is
all
the
night.
mile distance?
She said she thought it was around 75 miles. That they didn't go the highway, though, like we would go.
Just a trailer.
No.
She said they took the draws and the lower places, but that there was a town they went through that was Reamsville. And I'm not sure if Reamsville's still on the map or not.
I haven't heard of it. But
Well, she said they stayed all night at Reamsville, that there was a couple of old ladies that took them in because the rainstorm was so bad they couldn't keep going. So it took them 3 days to make that trip, and I believe she said, they had to stay overnight, maybe 2 nights at that.
That's what Aunt Lena Landman said, wasn't it?
Well, Aunt Gladys wrote that too.
Yeah, Aunt Lena
Yeah.
Landman
Living
mentioned
in a
that.
tent.
Well, now
yeah.
after they got out to Phillips County,
Well, that's when they lived in the tent. In the
yeah,
chicken
and
house
they'd
or
built a
something.
chicken house, and then they also
Yeah,
had a tent.
all
Well,
right.
Uncle Steve was still with them. And, I always wondered how Uncle Steve ever met Stella Stone and married her. Well, I discovered that as I reread this. You see, the Stones lived right in that very same community. You remember that all those Stones lived around there?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's how he met
Well,
Stella
he married
Stone.
one of the Stones?
Yes, he married Clarence Stone's sister.
Oh, I didn't.
Uncle Steve married Claire Stone's sister.
Well, no wonder we
Yes.
were good
Corey.
friends with Stones.
Corey's
No, her name was Stella, but
Stella.
Cora is Clarence
Clarence
Stone's
Stone's wife.
But anyway, Stella was Uncle Steve's wife, and he met her there and married her. And after he married her, they went back and lived in Phillips County. But they used to laugh. My mother used to tell that Aunt Stella was the funniest lady. When she was going with Uncle Steve, that she would always keep him laughing. I don't know if you ever knew Aunt Stella, but she
Yeah.
was real
No,
funny.
I
Sure
don't-
we
I-
did.
I don't remember.
I remember.
Yeah.
Anyway, my mother said they had old Model T. They had a few old Model T Fords, or they had buggies or something, and they went up to Sod Church. And so Aunt Stella would be up there, and she'd always get up in the wagon and be doing a lot of hoop-to-law to carry it on and yelling and singing. And they had more fun with Aunt Stella. But anyway, she married Uncle Steve, and they moved to Jewell County. And it was after that when they were converted. They weren't converted then. So anyway, that's how the Cockrofts got out there to Phillips County. And all that story, you're right, Aunt Lena told a lot about the buildings and their work with the buildings. Aunt Gladys said they hired a man from Alma to build the house.
Carpenter. Huh?
Yeah, that his name was A.M. Yost, I think, or something like that. And that Fabian was the plasterer. And she gave a little sidelight on the Fabians because she said that was the Fabian that was drunk all the time. And then later she said, though he changed and he was a good man and he didn't drink so much. But I've thought about that afterwards. The Fabians did have that bit of a reputation, and it was too bad. But anyway, those two men she mentioned had built the house. I don't know how the rest of you ever thought about that house, but it was an awful little house for so many people.
wasn't it
Now
just a
this
square?
farm, I think we should
Yeah,
clarify
go
the
ahead.
part of the farm. From Phillipsburg, actually Phillipsburg was in Kansas there south, and Alma, Nebraska was north, Alma and Republican City. And this farm is located about halfway between Phillipsburg and Alma, Nebraska. And actually the farm was located about 2 miles south of the Nebraska line, and about a mile and a half to the east then. And then that would place it about 15 miles north, 12 to 15 miles north of Phillipsburg,
Yeah, I think so.
and then about a mile and a half then to the east. And if you came the highway out of Phillipsburg, I believe that used to be number 1 or number 30.
I think maybe one.
Number 1, and it ran from Phillipsburg to Alma, Nebraska. And so that's the general location of this farm that they bought and built the house on. And first they lived in that chicken house and a tent, and then the guy that Evelyn's talking about that helped him build the house. So I think we can move on up into the general then part of grandfather, of course, was a farmer then, and he lived on this place and started farming and rearing the family, and then we have already mentioned about Uncle Steve, who was a Patnode, being out there too. And then we get to the part of actually
Grandpa's family.
Grandpa Cockroft's family. Ivan, of course, was the oldest of the family, and then there was Gladys, and then there was Lena, and then
What is Gladys's middle name? Lena couldn't remember.
Gladys May.
Okay, Gladys May.
I don't think we need to worry about a middle name.
No, but she was having to think of it.
Yeah.
But anyway, our
Gladys was second.
Gladys was second, and then there was Lillis, and
She's the one that had the funny middle name. Her name was Lillis Levita.
Levita.
Yeah.
I never heard that.
Oh,
No
yes, it
kidding. Okay, so then there was Lillis, and then there was our Uncle Glenn. And Uncle Glenn was about what? How much younger than?
Well, he was born in 1910, so he put him 8 years younger than Aunt Lillis.
8 years younger than Aunt Lillis. And then there was a younger son that was born, and as I recall discussion about it, he's buried over there at the cemetery at Sod Church.
I think he was a stillborn.
And he was stillborn baby, and so a pleasing thing in my life was when we were back for Aunt Gladys's funeral in Alma, Nebraska. Uncle Glenn and Kenneth, who's the son of Lena, and myself got together, and we went out to the old Cockroft farm, and then we went over by Sod Church, and we did locate that grave.
Wonderful.
And it said on the little stone, it said Cockroft, a baby boy. Just Cockroft, baby boy. And it gave a date, and I can't remember. I think it was about 19...
Would it be 12? If
I
Dad
thought
was
a
born
couple
in
of
I
years
believe
after
it was
Glenn.
about 1912.
I think
But
so,
it is
too.
on the stone, and we were real happy to locate that grave.
I never knew that until I was an adult, that he had a baby brother that
I
died.
didn't
Oh.
either, and I don't think a lot of us knew
They
it.
didn't talk much about
Evidently,
that.
he was a full-term baby, though.
That's what I've
And I
understood.
think he was stillborn.
Yeah, I think so too. And he's buried there. Well, you see, then that would I'm trying to think. They had the school Pleasant Hill. We probably need to bring that in now. That school was started over there. That was just, what is it? How far would it have been?
A mile north of the granddad's farm.
That's where your father would have started
Yes,
to
and
school.
you know our father didn't go beyond the 6th grade. But now Aunt Lena and Aunt Lillis graduated from the 8th grade, and so did Uncle Glenn, all there from that school.
Before we get too far afield, I wanted to get a few more memories of that house.
Oh,
when
yeah,
we
I
were
wanted-
back there.
Okay.
Just the size of that house.
Yeah, all right.
I still can't figure out they got so many people in the house. That's what I said.
That's what I wonder.
Well, you know, it looked like there was just one bedroom that they actually used. That was what's so funny. You guys remember you come in on a porch?
Yeah, but Aunt Lena said they built that porch on later, wasn't it?
Yes, I think so.
Porch
But
went on
the
later.
pictures that you
Porch?
see have the porch on.
Porch and the kitchen.
But
Oh, they'd had to have the kitchen
on.
on.
That's,
That porch and the kitchen went on later, according to what Aunt Lena said.
I didn't remember about the kitchen. Oh,
Okay.
my goodness, I knew the
You-
porch did.
You know the room?
That was even worse.
Did you want the rooms? Okay. We'll say the porch and the kitchen went on later. So on the west side of the house was a kitchen on the northwest corner, and the big porch was just to the south of the kitchen, so on the west side. Then right back of that porch area was a real large bedroom, kind of in an L shape. And then right to the north of that bedroom and to the west or east of the kitchen and that part of the porch was the dining room. And then right on east of the dining room was what they called the front room, and they kind of called it the parlor. And I remember so much the old piano.
No, not piano, organ.
I mean organ.
Pump
Excuse me,
organ.
or pump organ.
Pedal
Yeah.
organ. I remember that.
Yeah, pump
Did
organ.
you try it out?
Beautiful. Boy, it was beautiful. Upright, tall, and
So
had
they had
all the
music
fancy
in their
words,
life then too.
wood, and
I don't know who played it, but eventually Aunt Gladys did.
And Gladys.
Yeah, and how long they'd had it, I don't know.
And Grandma was interested in training Uncle Glenn to play it, but he didn't like the idea. So right to the south then of that parlor or that living room was a bedroom. Another
And that
bedroom.
was their spare bedroom,
That's
and it
right.
had a closet. But you see, it would seem like the way they slept is Grandpa and Don says that's an L-shaped bedroom. Well, Grandpa and Grandma had a bed in this part. Then there was another big bed over here. And it seemed like Aunt Lena and Aunt Lila slept in it. And then Uncle Glenn, they had him a little bed still in the other corner. He got bigger. Well, after Aunt Lena and Aunt Lilith were married and left, and Uncle Glenn always slept in that extra bed there.
Yeah, but Uncle Glenn really was in that south bedroom off from the parlor or the...
Well, he wasn't always in there, because
No,
let me tell you.
later on.
Yeah.
Later on.
That's what I'm saying. You
But-
see, that they let the school teacher board there. Well, now, where's their room to put the school teacher?
Well, that's where she slept.
Yes, but then they had to crowd everybody
That'd have been
else out.
our mother.
Well, I know. That's what I'm saying.
Our mother slept
How'd
in
they
there.
get all those people in that house?
Then when Bill and myself would go over to Grandpa's, oh man, we'd go over to Grandpa's. Seemed like about every week we'd spend one night or two over at Grandpa's and Grandma's, and we'd always get one of those great big sugar cookies when we'd go in there, and I'll never forget. Grandma would have that nice big table in that dining room, and she would have the sugar and the
Yeah, she had left about on the
salt
table.
and pepper and probably some silverware, and she'd always have this one container with those sugar cookies. Oh man, were they good! And then she'd have a dish towel put over it, see, and boy, we'd go over there and look in there, and we'd get one of those big sugar cookies, and Grandma made the best cookies I've
Well,
ever
see, that came from the Patnodes. Don't you remember eating sugar cookies down to the Patnodes? And they did the same thing. They'd have a glass container of sugar cookies.
And we'd always sleep. Bill and I would sleep in that extra bed in this L-shaped bedroom. I'll never forget. Grandpa Cockroft would snore quite a bit. So Grandpa and Grandma slept in the main bed, and we were back in this L shape in another bed. Bill and myself would sleep in that bed. And of course, Grandpa always got up pretty early in the morning and get going, and so we'd get up later on, of course. But anyway, we spent probably at least one night or two nights every
Well,
2
I
weeks.
remember that too, Don, but the part I remember is Grandma would never let us little dirty kids get in her nice clean bed. She always made us take her shirts off. She'd never let
Oh,
us
yes,
get in
she
her
had
nice clean beds.
beds. She had nice
Oh,
clean
she
beds.
had nice pillows, great big pillows, man.
I remember that.
I
She wouldn't let
remember,
us in her
yeah,
bed.
no question.
Where was Grandma's house from where you lived? Were you down on the Sear place at that time?
Yeah, we were at the Sear place. At that
Okay,
time,
so it
weren't
was
we?
only
You know,
about
I
Yeah,
think
but
when-
I think we better go back
Yes, yes.
to the part and start covering the part of when Dad and Mother perhaps
how they met.
how they
I
met.
got
I'd like to go back to the time when Uncle Steve and the family came to Kansas, to Phillips County, Kansas, and then of course we hit that war, World War I, and we talked about religious things and this kind of thing. And Uncle Steve and his family, evidently then, if they were in Phillips County, they moved back to...
Oh, yes, they went to Jewell County after
they
they were
went back
married.
to Jewell County. And he was a strong Nazarene.
But that happened, like I'm saying, after they were back in Jewell County.
He was a strong Nazarene, and so we used to go down there and visit the Patnodes, and always Uncle Steve, because Uncle Steve and Dad were real close. And during the time, it impressed me quite a bit was at the time that Dad was in World War One. Why, Uncle Steve and he were real religiously associated, and we went down there. I'm sorry this breaks me up, but I tell you, Uncle Steve talked to Dad about instances of prayer and World War II. One.
Well, he prayed for Dad. He had a commitment to Dad to pray for him in World War One.
And one time when we were down there, we went clear over into the field, and Uncle Steve had a great big tree over there, and a log, and that's where he went to pray.
Wonderful.
And,
You can see what influences the Patnodes have had on our family, and Uncle Steve really did on my dad.
and they mentioned about a battle they were in, and that they were visiting about it, and Uncle Steve asked Dad if he remembered a certain time, and he said, yeah, I remember that battle, because the colonel came by and said, well, boys, we're going to lay down our life for our country tonight. And Dad said that they did go into battle, and of the about 48 men in that squadron that went up there, there was only 6 of them came back. And so Uncle Steve visited with Dad about that, and he had a vision of the angel's wings being over Dad and protection.
Dad says he also told him that in this vision that he also saw a big balloon with a man looking down on the battlefront. And Dad said that was absolutely true, that the men did go up in balloons over the battlefronts and in order to get word back to them. And the only way Uncle Steve would ever have known that is if God had revealed it to him at the same time he did with this angel hovering over him.
What age was your father when he went into the service?
Well,
Went in,
he entered in 1917, and he was born, now you can help me figure it out, he was born in 1895 in August, and he went in September 1917. So it would have been, yeah. Now we need to back up when he met Mother and fill that in a
that's
little.
Yeah,
too.
I think so.
Yeah, because he met her before the war. She came up there to teach school. You know, we need to mention that our mother was Gertrude Lake, and that the Lakes had come to Phillips County in the 1870s, even before the Cockrofts ever came to Phillips County. The Lakes were among early pioneers in Phillips County. And also her mother's family, who were the Phillips, also came to Phillips County by 1880. So they were all there earlier and had lived in that area. And her father and mother met each other kind of in the Iowa Union area. They were all on farms, and they learned to know each other there. And that's where her mother and father met each other and were married. But her mother died of cancer in 1907. And it left Grandpa Lake, see, just with the 2 girls and then the boy. And he had a hard time. He tried to raise them. He tried to do what he could. But eventually, Aunt Eddie and Uncle Frank raised our mother and Aunt Merle. And Uncle Jess, the boy, married young. I think he married as young as 18. Probably as soon as the family was sort of disbanded. But the Lakes always meant a lot to us. Don't you remember?
Oh, yeah, I remember going down.
I remember when we used to go down to Grandfather Lakes,
Grandpa Lake.
and that was down in Kansas. I mean, in Nebraska.
Oh, no, that's a little bit, yeah, that was a little bit later.
But,
Yeah,
that
you
was
can
I
last-
don't remember the Grandpa Lakes much. The ones I remember.
I was thinking about Aunt Eddie and Iva. That's who I'm
Uncle
talking
Frank.
about.
Oh,
Uncle
well,
Frank
I mean,
and Aunt Eddie.
yeah, but I mean, that's
Yeah.
when Grandpa Lake was still alive.
Yes, but he didn't, as time went on, what happened was that, see, then Aunt Eddie and Iva, and, well, Aunt Eddie and Uncle Frank, actually, because Iva was younger son, raised our mother and Aunt Merle, and Mother got 2 years of high school. You know, that's all high school Aunt Gladys had, too, when she taught school. Our mother had 2 years of high school, and then she went to some kind of an institute to finish her teacher's training. And Aunt Gladys always said our mother was really smart, that she made the highest grades on her tests in the county when she got her teacher's certificate. And I think she was a brilliant woman. Don't you think so?
I know she was.
Yeah, I think she was.
No question. No
And
question
anyway,
about that.
she did, and that Aunt Lena, I think she mentioned in her tape that she went to school to our mother.
To your mother.
And also Aunt Lillis, and Aunt Lillis told me one time that it was our mother that brought her out of the kinks. You know, Aunt Lillis was left-handed, and she had trouble in school, and she said, well, your mother helped me, brought me out of the kinks. Well, anyway, she taught school there at least 2 years at Pleasant Hill. I've never been able to figure out, you know, the exact years because my mother didn't write that down for me.
And stayed with Joe
And stayed
Cockroft.
with the Joe Cockrofts, and that's how she met
All
her
that
dad.
time.
And it would have been as early as 1914, I think. So that's how she happened to teach Aunt Lena and so forth, and Aunt Lillis. And then she taught over at the Crystal Creek School and lived with the Horns. But that's still, you know, within the same area. Well, then the war came on, like Don mentioned now, and Dad was called into service in 1917. So you could see it's not that many years afterwards. But by that time, they were engaged, even though, you know, they had not married yet. But they were engaged by the time he went to war. And it seemed to be a terrible blow to them that Dad was called up in the war. Just terrible.
So he was more or less drafted.
He was drafted. And he went with a group from Phillips County. There's a picture, I think, of the group that went from Phillips County, and it was a great big bunch. He went first to Camp Funston, that you mentioned, down at, well, it's Fort Riley now. And I don't know why they called it Camp Funston, because they don't call it that anymore, but they did there then. And he was there about 6 weeks, and then he was moved to Camp Cody, New Mexico. And he was at Camp Cody, New Mexico, until they shipped him out to New Jersey to go overseas.
That was at the time they were going to get married.
Yeah, right. See, and then on May 1st, 1918, they were going to have a double wedding with Aunt Gladys and Uncle Charles. And going to have it be a home wedding there at the Cockroft house. Again, all the things that went on in that little house.
Not even knowing it.
Well, and that mother didn't, well, that Dad's leaves were canceled. I thought that he was shipped out right that very day. He wasn't shipped out that very day, but his leave was all canceled, and I guess he was so flabbergasted, he didn't know what to do, or he couldn't do anything. I don't know what, but they didn't know that he wasn't going to come for the wedding.
Did Charles and Gladys
And so
go
they
ahead?
went ahead with the wedding the best they could, and it seems to me it was a day or two later before they knew that Dad wasn't coming and why he wasn't coming.
Oh, how hard on your
Why,
mother.
terribly hard. And so they were trying to go ahead and have this wedding, and there was Grandma crying and everybody crying and carrying on, and they were trying to have this wedding. And I've told the boys, and Aunt Lillis told me, yes, and I didn't even get to see the wedding because they had me down in the milk house whipping cream for the bride's cake, and I didn't even get to see the wedding.
And they went on ahead without
And they went
her?
ahead and had the wedding. And,
Goodness.
well, they tried to have a celebration. Well, that night they had some kind of a chivalry crowd that came there for Aunt Gladys and Uncle Charles, and they always teased our mother because they said she was trying to peek through the keyhole in the bridal chamber, and Uncle Charlie opened the door and hit her in the eye, and so she had a black eye.
Oh, was that a real story?
Oh, that's a real story.
A real story.
Oh, that's a real story.
Oh,
But
don't
the
tell
only-
it for a real story.
But the only thing was, what I think about that gives a little insight into the upsetting time that day was.
my.
Because, see, I think
Yeah, terrible.
our mother never talked about that day very much.
I've never heard that.
No, she never talked about that day very much, never afterward very much. And I think she tried to be a little hilarious.
Of course.
And
of
it just
course.
really it was a very difficult day. It was a difficult day for all of them.
Well, she'd
Yes.
given up her job teaching, and she at Pleasant Hill. And-
Well,
and
no, not
then
much.
didn't she go to LaBelle?
Yeah, she went to LaBelle and taught that year.
Hmm.
Yes. See, they didn't know. I guess it seems uncertain. These days of communication, you don't realize how it must have been. They didn't have to know what was going on.
No telephones yet?
No. Well,
Or
they had
they didn't.
telephones, but you didn't do long distance
No, no.
telephoning. They had local telephones.
So they shipped Dad out to New Jersey. And
Yes, but he went overseas. But he didn't know what was going to happen to him either. They had him sitting down there at Camp Cody a certain number of days, and he didn't know what was going to happen. And then they finally shipped him to Camp Merritt, New Jersey, and he finally went to Nova Scotia, and there was a troop ship. I think he says in his memoirs that there were 25,000 soldiers on that troop ship that they took overseas. It was just so crowded. He tells about that he saw a whale, they got shelled once, and, the experiences of going over it. But I looked through the things today, And there is a card in Aunt Gladys's memoirs that says, Ivan Cockroft arrived safely with the troops. And that's all it says on it. Doesn't say where it's from or anything, but it's a card sent by the government that Aunt Gladys must have saved all those years.
Now he went and they landed over there and did the most of the fighting in Dad's case was the Argonne Forest.
In France.
In France, in the southern part be southwest part of Germany and northern France. Is that right?
He was all in France. He tells in his memoirs that he was in 4 fronts in France, and he tells what they were, but he was in the Argonne when the war was over.
The Argonne when the war was over.
Yeah, see? And they thought at home when the armistice was signed, see, which would have been over, Dad would have been gone. He went, what I tell you, September 1917. Well, the armistice was, November 1918. Well, they thought, he would be coming home. But instead, they took those boys off the front and took them into Germany as armies of occupation. And that's what Dad was. He became part of the Army of Occupation in Germany. So his fighting was not in Germany, but that's where he was in the Army of Occupation. That's where he met Bill Story, too, was in the Army of Occupation. He was billeted with Bill Story in a home in one of these towns where they were.
What kinds of things would he have done there in Germany? Did he ever say?
They were billeted in private homes, and they evidently tramped the city and were kind of protectors and
like military police.
Visible.
Yeah, they were kind of like military police. I think Don's got the right word. That's the way it acted. And these German families had to feed them.
You said Bill Story. Now, he kept in contact
Yes,
with
he
Bill
did.
Story all his
Always,
life.
but that's where he met him. He was paired up with him as he was in this Army of Occupation in Germany, and they were billeted together.
2 really extremely close friends
Now,
established.
if I remember right, did Dad and Mom go down and
Yes,
visit
they
them,
did. And
later
Bill
on?
Story also, after, yes, they did one time.
Yeah, one
But
time
after
later
Dad and
on.
Edna had moved to, what's the name of the town they lived down in Kansas?
Story?
No, I'm talking
Eudora.
Eudora. After Dad and Edna were living there, they kept some kind of track. I think they must have sent Christmas cards or something. Bill Story died, and his wife sent a message to Dad, telling Dad, but Dad was not able to go to the funeral. So Bill Story died before Dad, even though he was some younger, I think.
As a kid, what made a big impression on me about Bill Story was how close friendship he and Dad had over there. And then Grandma Cockroft had a picture on her sitting there on this organ, and the one guy, Dad, I guess, was sitting on the stool, and Bill Story was up there with his hand like this, and Dad had that 6-shooter, and the smoke went up around there, and there's a sign that says, "We want to go home." and
That was our memories. I never saw Bill Story, but Dad thought lots of him.
But that you made an impression on me as
well,
a kid.
that's only that, it was in one of those old-time special iron frames, too.
Yeah.
Well, shall I tell you, I inherited 2 of those.
Good.
And anyway,
See, that's the first time she's telling us
She's
about it.
confessing now.
I inherited my dad's, and then Aunt Gladys gave me hers. Well, guess where one of them is? And maybe that's not the right place, but Richard has it. And it's a very special
The next
moment to
generation.
him. But anyway, I've still got one.
Now, we've had your dad overseas yet.
Let's bring him home.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Well, he was
Get married.
in August of 1919. And again, I don't know if he knew very far ahead of time he was going to get out. I'm just amazed at how little they knew about what was going on. But he was dismissed on August 8th, his birthday in 1919. They brought him home first. He said on a German ship that was really a special ship. Really, they had good care and everything when they came home. Wonderful ship. And were dismissed out of Iowa someplace. And on his birthday, August 8th, 1919. And he got home in August, but they were not married till September 3rd, 1919. And they had a little home wedding down at the lakes. And that's where they were married.
Now, Frank Lake and Etta Lake were the 2 people that my mother and Aunt Merle lived with. And of that family also their immediate family was Ray and Iva. and they lived in general about 5 or 6 miles north of Phillipsburg and over perhaps 2 or 3 miles. Now, preceding them living over in that area, they had lived directly north of Phillipsburg. And I hear Mother talk about the old rock house.
Yeah, that's where they were married. They were married in
the old rock house. And the old rock house was located along that highway, just to the west of the highway, about another mile north of what we called the Red Top School. And that would place it about 2 miles north of the road that you turn to go over to the Kreider's place. And this is getting back over to our Uncle Glenn's wife's family, the Kreiders.
Well, Lakes
But
lived in
anyway-
different places through the years.
But anyway, the rock house was located over there. Now, I never did see the rock house.
No, it disappeared, I think, as
And,
time went on.
It was located on the west side of the road. Now, the reason I remember about the rock house was because in the early 1930s, when they had the WPA, why my dad worked on that highway over there and drove some. He was good about handling horses and mules, and he drove this great big I think there was 8 head of these mules on those plows and scrapers and so forth, and Dad drove them. And Dad pointed out to us where the old rock house used to be located. So Bill and I had ridden our horses over there to see how they were working, and Dad pointed that out to us of where the rock house was located. And of course then Frank Lake then lived just south of there about a mile, and there was a school down there called Red Top. And he lived on over, kind of on the creek on over there. Now that was at the first. Of course he lived other places, but in general he lived north of Phillipsburg and back to the east, about 5 or 6 miles north of Phillipsburg and 3 or 4 miles east of that road. Anyway, in the general area.
What did your father do for work? Did he farm when he
Dad
came
was
home?
farming, and we all were living then. Actually, we were living on the Sear place then, but I think we should go back and to the time that Dad and Mother were married.
Yes.
And they then lived over on what Grandfather Cockroft called the North 80, and it seems like every one of the Cockroft children, Ivan starting it off perhaps, Ivan and Gertrude lived over there in that little house. And we hear that mentioned by a good many people.
They didn't own that house in the very beginning either. I'm not just sure when they bought that place over there. I mean, when they first came from Jewell County, that wasn't part of the deal. That North 80 was added.
And as near as I recollect, that little old house was there, and then Uncle Fred and Uncle Lawrence, was it?
It could have been.
Went
Uncle
over
Lawrence
there
lived there at one time.
went over there and remodeled that house and built a room on the north and some other buildings, because at the time I remember this house, and it would be located northwest of Joe Cockroft, our grandfather's house, approximately, we'll say a half a mile, quarter of a mile to a half a mile, and on kind of a ridge around there. And it was located over there. So Dad and Mother lived over there to start with, and about how long would they have lived there?
Well, you see, when they were married, that very first year they didn't live there. Dad lived with his folks and was just getting it ready over there.
And
Mother lived with the Lakes, and she was teaching at LaBelle, her second year at LaBelle. And they did that. And then, when the year was up in April, then they did move on to that place. And I don't know, that would have been it was the year I was born. They moved up there in the spring, April, after Mother's school was out, of 1920. And I was born that year, and we've talked about that, maybe till 1924.
They lived
like
in
that.
that place
So
on
you
the
were
80s.
born in that house. the
Yes,
north-
I was born in
north
that
Indian.
house, and so were Bill and Don.
Okay, then if we lived there, when did we move to Holly Place?
Well, that's what I'm thinking. It might have been around 1924 or 5.
Okay, so 1924.
Might have been 1925. I'm not sure.
We moved. We went then a mile east of Grandfather's place and a mile north, up on the hill, up what was called the Walter Hawley place, And so then we lived there quite a few
Well, I
years.
think 4 years probably.
4
I think we
years.
might have moved there in 1925 instead of 24 and lived there till about 1929 because Dean was born there.
Now, Dad was farming. Dad was farming all this time too, and of course, this only being from a mile to 2 miles away from our grandfather, they farmed more or less together. My dad always helped my granddad farm.
Still with horses.
Yeah, with
Yeah,
horses.
Yeah, it was.
And I'll never forget up there on that farm, up there on the Holly place. Why, Dad, we had this one nice big black mare, and she came into the barn then, and he'd get out there and get them in the barn fairly early and take care of them and get them ready to go to work. And I believe, wasn't this on a Sunday?
I don't know what day of the week it
Anyway,
was.
he went in down to the
I
barn
don't
there
think so.
and got them in. I believe it was probably a Saturday morning. And that bloomin' mare was called Topsy, and she kicked my dad right there right across his chin. And I tell you what, I've never seen anybody bleed so much in all my life. And I thought Dad was going to die because it brought him up to the house.
And it kicked him against the side of the barn even.
And we got him up to the house. And Mother called the neighbor, Clarence Stone.
I think she sent Bill down to Clarence Stone's to get him.
And Clarence Stone come up there then to the house and took him to town and to Republican City, I believe it was,
To
and
Doc
Dr.
Talcott.
Talcott.
Yeah. And
And
that's when we started doctoring with Dr. Talcott.
Stitches, I suppose.
Oh,
Oh.
terrible! And Dad had a scar there from that.
Didn't break his
did
jaw.
Did you have any memory
Didn't
of
break
that at all?
his, well,
I don't think so.
I think it cracked, just fractured.
Yeah, it was just a terrible
And
place to heal, though.
Man, I tell you, he's lucky he didn't die. But old Clarence Stone was a real friend of my dad.
Well, they just lived down the hill from us on that
Well,
Holly
you
place.
said Clarence Stone, that would have been Uncle Steve's brother.
Brother-in-law,
Brother-in-law.
yeah, it would have been. And we really became friends with that family at that time. Really did, with the Clarence Stone family.
Old Clarence Stone was always one that liked to have a new car. And so, boy, I was glad he had a new car that time because he got Dad in that car, and I mean, he drove fast and got him to the dock. And so, from then on, we were even better friends of the Stone.
Well, you know, Bill and I started to school from to Pleasant Hill from there. And, you know, we had your mother.
Oh, is that where she
well,
taught?
first I had Mrs. Larkin, and then she left. And then your mother, I don't know how many years your mother taught at
And
Pleasant
she
Hill.
stayed with your grandparents.
Yes, again in that bedroom where I said they got so much room for so many people.
Really? Interesting.
And that Pleasant School then would be a mile west
Yeah, it was
of the
a
Holly place.
Yeah, it was. And we walked.
And it'd be a mile north of Grandfather's place.
Yeah.
Okay.
See?
And Don didn't start school there. He wasn't
No.
old enough.
Well,
Of course,
now,
he was born there.
Uncle Charlie and Aunt Gladys was living in Elma at this time?
Well, you know, I don't know exactly what part of the time they were.
Yeah.
But you know, they went to Ohio, and I'm not sure the
No,
year.
they were in Ohio.
They went.
Zanesville, Ohio.
About 1925, I think they went to Ohio.
That's when
Are
they were
you
in
down to
Ohio.
the Sear place yet? Because
No,
not
no.
quite, but
Oh,
we will
okay.
be.
No.
How long did they stay in Ohio?
Oh, I don't know how long. It's hard for me to realize. I don't know for sure.
And that was with his work?
Yes, you know, you remember that Aunt Gladys took Nina and Harry and took care of them? Well, their father was Tubbs. What was his first name? I don't know. Doesn't matter. He found a job in Ohio in the rolling mills of some kind. Steel mills.
Iron mill.
And he said that's a great place to move to. And he persuaded them to go too because they were taking care of his children. And so they moved to Ohio. And they were there several years. I would judge 4, 5, 6 years. I don't know.
Never knew that.
That's Nina and Harry Tubbs then is from that.
Yeah, and after
Tubbs
they got
thing.
back there to Ohio, Aunt Gladys had a very sad time because then he remarried and took Nina and Harry away from him.
Oh, my.
And they had a real...
Took them back.
Yeah, she had a sad time. But that's when she became a Free Methodist, was back there. Because she went to the Free Methodist Church. When she'd been in Alma, it wasn't the Free Methodist she'd been a part of. She became, we should go back to our dad and mom and their church.
Yes. do
Because
that.
they, you know, were in the beginning, and maybe you both all know that they were Quakers.
Now, when did that come about?
Well, you know, in the first place, I was telling you about going over to the sod church and Aunt Stella getting up and standing in the wagons and giving them a show and everything. Well, they would go to Sod Church because there was a kind of a Sunday school that went on there. And the reason they called that Sod Church, I guess, is I think in the early days there really had been a sod church there. And then there was a wooden building that's still there today. But anyway, as time went on, the Quakers came in and started a group down at the Englewood Schoolhouse. And the Quakers were very strong in Jewell County. They had an academy at North Branch, and they had lots of Quaker groups. Well, anyway, they had this group, and they had quite a thriving Quaker group at that Englewood Schoolhouse. And our dad and mother became part of that Quaker group. And there were pastors. I don't know. I even remember they're saying their names a lot of times. The Cravens and the Jones, and I think a Quaker pastor married him. Then, as time went on, they were still at that Englewood Schoolhouse when they were living across the road over there. And my mother used to get real upset. Dad would think he needed to go to the yearly meetings down at North Branch. And so he would drive a spring wagon, and sometimes Aunt Gladys would go because she'd be able to get free. But Mom said she had us little tiny kids, and so she couldn't go. And she'd get kind of irritated to death because she'd think he didn't need to go to those yearly meetings down the North
How long
Branch.
did they last?
I don't know, but a few days.
Several days.
At least it was more than a night or more than that, because they drove this spring wagon, down across the country, down there. Well, then as time went on longer, traveling evangelists started coming through more, and they held meetings, especially over there around Iowa Union. McIntosh is one of them, but there were others. And out of that came the Wesleyan Methodist group, because these people were Wesleyan Methodists. Now, we need to say that Dad was a very emotional Christian. You know that, don't you?
Well, yeah, I
Yeah.
know that.
Well, the Quakers were not very emotional.
Right, they were very quiet.
They were fine people, and Dad has spoken highly of the Quaker faith and the many fine Quaker people. But when these Wesleyan Methodists came through, the ones, I haven't known, there are a lot of Wesleyan Methodists that are not emotional at all, but some of them were that came through the country, and I think that appealed to Dad and the people in the group. They liked that more feeling and more enthusiasm and all of that. So they decided they would switch, and switch. In fact, they switched the whole Quaker group to Wesleyan Methodist, and at the time the McKinneys were Quaker pastors, and they switched to, became Wesleyan Methodist pastors.
Do you know about when that would have been?
Yes, I think it was about, it was after 1925. It must have been maybe 1927 or 8. Because the reason I think that is, it wasn't very long till they built the Englewood Church then.
And this is part of what Clarence Landman helped with.
Yes,
Lena's
and that
husband.
church celebrated its 50th wedding anniversary in 1979, which means it was dedicated in 1929. Okay. And I think they started building it in like 1928, and then it was dedicated in 1929, and Rothfuses came then to be pastors.
Now, in this changeover that took place, they worshipped first in a church that was just south of the present Englewood
Well,
Church.
that Englewood Schoolhouse they worshipped in.
Englewood Schoolhouse, and the Seventh-day Adventists also used that
We
church.
didn't mention that.
Was that?
Seventh-day Adventist. And Uncle Harvey was a Seventh-day Adventist, see? And so, and Shannon's, John Shannon.
And Art Francis.
And Art Francis.
Leslie Landman.
All right, several of them were Seventh-day Adventists. And they worshipped in there too on Saturday, and then we on Sunday, and they also then had a school, see? There was a school there
They
during
used
the
that
week.
building.
And that started back when the Quaker group was.
Yeah,
there was
that's
still
when
a
they were
Quaker group.
Quakers.
But conflict continued, so it was important to get a church built.
So then they switched over and built in the Englewood Church.
Yes, and it must have been dedicated, like I'm telling you, in 1920. I know it was dedicated in 1929 because I looked that up. We went to the 50th anniversary in 1979. And see, Dad was a charter member, Dad and Mother were, of that new congregation that was there. But so was Aunt Lena and Aunt Lillis. They also were charter members.
I knew Aunt Lena was, and I didn't
Well,
know
I
how
think
many
Aunt
others.
Lillis too. And then, there were some others. Aunt Jenny and Uncle Ernest Bugby were. And Newt and Fern Shimmerhorn. I'm trying to think. Do you think of anybody else that I don't think of?
But you grew up going to church as early as you could
And
remember.
the Quakers,
Oh,
I
we always
remember.
went to church.
Yeah, I remember the Quakers even, because I remember some of those Quakers.
Were there quiet times like
Yeah.
we hear about?
Well, I don't know so much. See, the form of the service I don't remember so much, but my mother said there was. That's one reason that Dad had become unhappy with it, is that he felt they were too quiet and reserved and so forth. So I don't know.
He had great respect, though, for the Christianity.
Oh my, yes, he did.
The
He
Christianity
did down to
of that church.
Oh, he had
Quaker.
nothing against the Quakers at all.
So Harry Rothfuss was the first minister when it became a Wesleyan church.
Well, the McKinneys continued for a
That's
little
true.
while
They'd
when
been
the
Quakers.
changeover was,
Okay.
but they weren't very long. And then Harry
We
Rothfuss
built
came.
that church, that Englewood church, McKinney's were.
Oh yeah, they were still there in the
Oh.
very beginning.
That's right at the beginning when
Yeah,
the church was
in
built.
the very beginning.
And
And the parsonage that was moved in there, the McKinneys were still
and
there.
the whole congregation worked as carpenters and first they had a big basement in it, and I'll never forget Dad and Ernest Bugby and all of the men would take their horses and teams down there, and they dug out. Ernest Bugby, by the way, donated the land for that church and also for the parsonage.
Yes, there was quite a little piece of land in there.
And so anyway, the Englewood Church then was located, we'll say, from my granddad's place would have been 2 miles to the east, and then about 5 miles south on the east side of the road. And that is in the general area of the Englewood area, because the Englewood School was just down about a mile south, or half a mile south.
Do you remember going to that church?
You bet. I
Well,
remember.
why don't you tell us what you remember?
Well, what I
down there?
remember about the church, see,
Yeah.
the Rothfusses is the first I remember. And Don Rothfuss and I were good friends when we were
Yeah,
small.
would you say?
And probably Dale Rumbaugh at Lillis and Son
I
Dale.
would think so.
And I remember going down, and Don Rothfuss and I'd stay down with Don or whatever, and then we'd play and stuff. But some of the things I remember about one of the things I remember about the Englewood Church is having the camp meeting out in the tent.
Oh, yeah, right. Those
Across
big
the
tents
road,
they
wasn't
put
it?
up. Yes, they have different places, but
And
one's
you talk
supposed to-
about being verbal. Now they were verbal.
Oh, yes.
Very verbal. They weren't too quiet when it comes to
No, and you
church.
know, I have seen Dad fall under the Spirit. And not in later years, but in those years, under a real burden of prayer, and just be under a real burden of prayer. And that was during that period of time. But you know, even in later times, when he has visited me, maybe in our church here in Greeley, I don't know, that he would stand and wave his hand, you know. He just was always very outgoing with his Christianity.
And willing to share his testimony.
And always
Yeah.
willing to share his testimony.
And
Of course-
when
Go ahead.
the minister was giving his sermon and preaching, Dad would always try to be up fairly close to the front, and he'd always say, "Amen,
Yeah.
amen, amen."
They used to tease Dad and say he doze off to sleep.
Well, Dad, I'll have to tell you of an instance like that. It was the minister that came there after the Rolfuses, and at the Englewood Church, and that'd be the new church. And so Dad, of course, he worked hard, and he was, of course, real religious, and we always went to church. I tell you, if it rained or whatever, we went to church.
I need to mention that.
And Dad would always get a team of horses lined out and get the wagon lined up, and Bill and I'd ride our riding horse, and Dad would have the rest of the family in this wagon, and we'd go to church. And we'd pick up people along the way.
I remember, Don, though, you was talking about that. I can remember those days going to church in the wagon, and Mom used to heat stones
Yeah, and the
in the
coal.
stove, and then wrap them in towels and put them in the wagon.
Yeah, she
I
did
remember
for
that
us.
part.
And we'd
That
have
was-
covers when we
Of
were
course, that's
younger.
when we moved down to
You
the
know,
center place.
they had a Model T Ford, but I don't know, seemed like the roads were always bad or something. A lot of times we went to church in the wagon, like Don's telling me.
Right. We'd have rains that last for 3 or 4 days.
Well, we must have started pretty early, because I don't ever remember being late to
No,
church.
our mother, she didn't believe in the Cockroft way of being late. And she would get us to church on time. And our mother was very active in church. She taught Sunday school. Oh, she taught all ages, I think. And she had children's work, too. She would do children's kinds of things.
And Dad taught the men.
Did he?
Yeah, in later years,
That'd be
they
in Sunday
still-
school. When the children were down for Sunday school classes, Mother would have the women's classes, and Dad would have the men. And do you know that this same thing occurred when we were at Delta?
In Nazarene Church.
Nazarene
Is that
Church
right?
in Delta.
Very
Same
strong
thing.
leadership then.
Yeah,
And,
they
yeah.
were.
Yeah.
The reason we were Nazarenes at Delta is because we didn't have a Wesleyan church in
No.
Delta.
No, and then you see, Dad, I really do think this idea of Dad being very verbal about his faith and so forth still was some of the influence of Uncle Steve. Do you know Uncle Steve? He was. He always was
Oh,
very
I think
verbal.
that's right.
And I think
No
that
question.
had some influence on Dad. Dad wrote in his thing about that he points his conversion. He didn't know for sure when he was converted. But on the way to Camp Funston, when he entered the service, he told me to write, that he just told the Lord that he was going to be a Christian and he was going to live for him. And that was on the way to Camp Funston in 1917. And that somebody saw him praying and said to him, Cockroft, what church do you belong to? And he said, I belong to the Church of God. And he said he didn't even know that was really a church. So he was telling people he belonged to the Church of God and they didn't know any better. But anyway, I know he did at least rededicate his life at that time when he went into service.
Well, my father tells about being taught to pray from his mother's experience.
Grandma.
And so maybe
Grandma.
she influenced Ivan as well.
Oh,
within
well,
the
she
home.
did. We're losing out on that influence of Grandma's mother, of Dad's mother. They say she just prayed so hard for Dad while he was service, too. It wasn't just Uncle Steve.
Sure.
Grandma did, too.
Oh, everybody.
Yeah, they just prayed and prayed for Dad, and Grandma was a very faithful prayer.
Mm-hmm.
And she and Grandpa would go to church, too. But it was just like, I think it's Grandpa's fault. They would just be late, dragging in.
Oh,
That's
yeah.
what got my mother upset. She said, we aren't going to grow up. You're not going to grow up like that. And I don't, like I said, I don't know that it was Grandma's fault. I don't know whose fault it was.
It was Granddad's.
I think it was. He just dragged in too late. And then
Well,
he'd
it's
always,
passed down the generations, I think.
Grand-
then he'd always be too late. Well, Grandpa didn't have any sense of time. He was a good worker and everything, but he just
He's
kept
a
that thing.
grandfather Cockroft, Joe Cockroft, was the hardest working man you ever saw, but the poorest manager in the whole world. He was the poorest manager with his money, with his planning, his work, and all of that. He would never get to the field in the mornings until at least 9 or 10 o'clock.
Well, we're talking about that late, and I always thought about with the teachers. I can remember that your mother used to worry sometimes about that she wouldn't get to school soon enough because they were kind of late getting around.
Getting the breakfast.
Yeah, getting breakfast over and getting her lunch ready and all that.
Sure.
And I was old enough to know that she worried about that a little. Because that was just one of their traits.
And Granddad would be late getting to the field, so he'd be late coming in for dinner, and he'd be in at dinner at about 2 o'clock, and then he'd be out in the field after that, and he wouldn't get in from the field till about 7 o'clock, and then he had he always took good care of his horses. No matter if he came from the field at
he
7
did.
o'clock, he always watered those horses, put them in the barn, fed them, and everything, and then he'd milk the cows. Then he'd go milk
And
the
they'd
cows.
be eating supper at 9 o'clock.
9 o'clock, they'd eat supper.
Well, yeah, but Don, no, when you say that's the reason he didn't get around so early in the morning, it wasn't that he didn't get up early. He was always had his chores to do.
And he was kind of
Yeah.
slow at it and
And
had to fiddle around with stuff.
You know, chores to me, I remember, chores wasn't really a job. That was just something
Yeah.
that you did every day.
And he raised
That's right.
pigs. Did he have hogs? Or?
Yes, some, but not huge amounts. And they had some cattle and they milked cows.
Cattle and horses.
Yeah,
Cows and
they
horses.
did. They
Grandfather Cockroft was probably one of the better hog people. He had the real ability to raise hogs. He had black Poland China hogs. And black Poland Chinas at that time were good hogs, but they generally didn't have very many pigs in their litters. Probably 7 or 8 pigs was as large a litter as any of them ever had, but he had good hogs. And then he also in a big feedlot between the North 80, the house over on the North 80, and his house was a little bit kind of a gulch in there, and then he always fed cattle in that feedlot, and then he'd have hogs, fattening hogs, following those cattle. And my dad went over there one time. We helped make a self-feeder to feed shelled corn in a pen inside of this big cattle pen so that the hogs could get in and the cattle couldn't, and the pigs would go in there and eat that extra corn. And so, yeah, my granddad was a pretty good cattleman. But the big part about Granddad Cockroft was this: he loved his horses, and he took such good care of his horses and had good horses, and he was a good cattleman too.
But you know, one of the things, and I think the boys would remember that too, that how dearly Grandma loved her children and grandchildren. She just dearly loved them, and Aunt Lois and Aunt Lena, they dearly loved us all too, and we all loved one another. We were always going over to Grandma's to eat, or, you know, having some kind of a birthday celebration for somebody.
Well,
Go ahead.
you know, Don and I spent a lot of time, of course, up at Alma with Uncle Charlie.
Yeah, Aunt Gladys was that.
'cause
Aunt Gladys received you with
we
open
were
arms.
we was up there a lot.
Oh, man.
But Donna, you know, Aunt Lena received us with open arms. Aunt
Yeah,
Lois
Lena
received us
Lois.
with open arms.
Family was important.
Yes, and it was just you never were out of place in going to see them.
Right.
You were never out of place.
I
You
remember.
were always welcome. To
Yeah.
Grandma, didn't matter what was going on, or with Aunt Lena or Aunt Lois or Aunt
And they
Gladys
always
either.
were ready to feed you.
Ready to feed you. If they didn't have something, they'd get it ready.
And that family placed a lot of emphasis on getting together.
Yes, they did.
And Aunt Gladys lived in Alma, and she'd call out there and she'd say, "We're going to be out Thursday night now. We're going to be out there. We'll bring the ice." And all the rest of us would get over there and go over to Grandpa's, and we'd get those big ice cream freezers
Yeah,
out
homemade
there,
ice cream.
and we'd make ice cream. And man, we used to have those ice cream suppers, family suppers,
Lots of times.
lots and lots of times.
That made you endure the summers in Kansas.
Oh,
I
goodness.
guess.
Do you know, Bill said that he's down there in Arizona, that he'll talk to, he loves having me write letters and tell him about things that are going on in Kansas, remind him of the old days and all. And he says, Dorotha said to him, "Why do you want to remember those old days so much?" And he said, "I just said those days were such days of great love for one another. How could you forget them?" That's what he wrote me not long ago.
Is that right?
Uh-huh. He said, "I couldn't forget it because of all the great love among in the family." And I thought about how important that is, that they all had time for one another.
Well, most of the family lived within, I'd say, a radius of about probably 5 miles, except at Alma, which would have been about 9 to 10 miles away. But all the rest of the families were in there in a radius of 5 miles, so that'd be 10 miles diameter. So they were fairly close. And so I think we need to go ahead and say that we were up there on that Holly place probably after we left that North 80, about 1925 to 1929. And then when we left there, we moved as a family a mile east and 2 miles south to a place called the Bugbee place. And my mother liked that place very much because there was a nice, great, big 2-story white house. There was this great, big, nice red barn like you see on old times.
Picture postcards.
Picture postcard. And the thing that was probably the drawback the most on that was that there wasn't quite enough farmland. My dad didn't think there was quite enough farmland, but it was a very fine place. And so we moved over there, and we lived over there then. I guess from 1929 to about 1931. Now, if we recall back, we were going through the Depression. Started back there in about 1928, 29,
But it wasn't very bad yet when we were living on the Bugbee place.
and 30, and then then in 1931, we moved over to what's called the Sear place. That'd be a mile back to the north, and then a mile west, and then a quarter mile to the north. Now, with all the rest of the family, you'll hear reference made to the Sear place.
Yes, because Donna lived on the Sear
I
place.
was born.
Everybody, most of
And
the
Dan Lee were born down there.
Yes,
most
me
of the
and Lee were
Cockroft
born.
family lived on the Sear place.
And some of them were born there. Donna
And,
and Jim were.
Yes. Yes.
And so let's go back just a little to the Bugby place. The year that we were about 1930 on the Bugby place, my dad, I'll have to admit, was a pretty hard worker and pretty good manager, along with my mother helping out. And so my dad got me, were driving a Model T Ford at that time. So my mother called Dad into the house there. We were loading out some hogs, and she called him in there, and she says, "Now, Ivan, you're not going to buy that Model A Ford up there that you've been looking at, are you?" And he said, "Well," he says, "I was kind of planning that."
Can't you see Dad kind of hitching his pants? And
Hey, he pulled up his pants. "Yeah, I was kind of planning that." And so she says, "Well, I hope you don't." But she knew he was going to. So he took that load of hogs to town, and he came back in that new Model A Ford. And Mother, he got out there and pulls in the yard, and he wanted Mother to come out there, and he got Mother in that car and was showing her about how to drive it and shift the gears and so forth. And she just wasn't real happy about it. So we were going down to church on Sunday morning about 6 months later, and doggone, right to the west side, we went down this gulch, crossing the gulch on the road going to Englewood to church, and Dad said there was a gutter there from,
must have been a gully or something.
a little bit of a gully there, washed out where it rained, and he caught the front wheel, and I'll be switched if we didn't turn her over.
No.
So Uncle Clarence Landman and his family came along, and they picked us up, and nobody was hurt. So we went on to church, and they got down there, and they stopped the church service and threw the kids and everybody into Sunday school, and the preacher and all the men came back up there and turned the car up, and it didn't hurt that car. It drained the gas out of her a little bit, and Dad threw some gas in her, and they brought her on down to church. Pulled the fender out of the right rear fender.
I didn't even
bent
remember
in,
what it did.
and it broke the window out on the right rear side. And so he brought her on down to church, and we had quite a time, And so we went back. So Rolfus was the minister at that time.
Mm-hmm.
So Ernest Bugby and his wife Jenny were great religious people, and Jenny was a sister of Clarence Landman, and so they board members. They were board members of the church, and another man by the name of what was it, Fouts? Jesse? Gene Fouts and his wife.
For Glenn.
They were.
Glenn's the son.
Glenn's the
Gene
son
and
of
Evelyn
Gene.
were the older couple.
And Glenn, Gene and his wife then lived over there another mile on east of Crystal Creek School.
That's where the Fouts
And Crystal Creek School was located a mile east of the Sear place. So they met down there at the church and prayed for direction from Almighty God about a car for Ralphus. And the next thing I know, Dad said something about prayers were answered. And so they came home and said, "Well, you're going to take that Model A Ford down there for Ralphus on, I don't know, in another week or something. You're taking that Model A Ford down there at Ralphus." And Dad had some money into a 29 Chevrolet that Granddad had, and so Granddad couldn't pay Dad, and so Dad went over then and told Granddad that he then was going to take over the 29 Chevrolet. So that's what we drove then, that 29 Chevrolet for many years. We even moved to Colorado with that 29
Yeah,
Chevrolet.
you tell about your remembering of that
Okay.
29 Chevrolet.
Now we're over at the Sear place.
Yeah, now he can tell about the 29 Chevrolet, because about
Well,
moving to
no, well, that
Colorado.
was later when we moved to Colorado.
Yeah.
Well, I know, but
Let's
you
cover
had
some
memories
things
of
on
it.
the Sear
Okay,
place.
all right.
Did
I
your
think our
mother,
time times
Did
about
your
it.
mother not object to
No.
using the car that way?
No, she didn't. She
Give
didn't
to the-
object.
Let's
Yeah.
take 5.
Take 5? Okay,
Sure.
let's do. Okay,
Charlie Sear had been our friends before that. When we lived up on the Holly place, we became friends with Charlie Sear, I believe. In and out, you know, we knew him.
so we moved down to the Charlie Sear place in 1931. And I remember when
In the
Dad...
spring.
In the spring
Yeah.
of 1931. And I remember Dad talking with Charlie. And Charlie said, hey, Ivan, he said, there's just one thing that did happen. And he says, here, about 2 years ago, I was up there in that south field, and I had a haystack down there to the south of it is a yellow clover haystack. And he said, a tornado came through. And he says, I saw that thing drop down and hit that haystack. And I was up along that road. And he says, I ran. He says, I could see the tail of it. Boy, just hit that haystack, and she just was tearing it all to pieces. And he said, I could see I was right in line. So he says, about that time I ran and I jumped and fell, or got right down the grader ditch of the road up there south of the house, the Sear place south of the house, coming down that hill. And he says, I got in there, and he said, boy, after the thing had gone over, he says, I began clawing my way out. He said, there was just hay all over me. And he says, I looks around, and he said that thing lifted into the air before it got down to that house. And she lifted in the air and went off a little bit to the northeast. And he says, I tell you what, he says, I hope that never happens again.
Well, you know, Charlie Sear had remained friendly to us. I don't know if the boys remember at one time after he'd moved back over to Franklin with his family. They invited our whole family over there and had us for lunch, and that was near Franklin, and showed us their farm and everything over there. So there were other times that we were friendly with Charlie Sear as the years went
How
on.
many acres was
How
that?
many acres do you think, guys?
In which?
At
Sear.
the on that Sear place.
Oh, the
farm.
Sear place was the house and those buildings, that was located on a 40 acres. And that was on a creek bottom. And we had a barn out to the north. And we had then the house there. We had a garage. There was this road went through between the garage and the house, going north and south. And there was a garage over on the west side. And then we had a chicken house and a brooder house, chickens over on the west side. And out to the west of the barn and across the road on the west was a big granary.
Yeah.
A
that
big
was it.
granary out there. So we had these different buildings out there. And my dad, of course, always had a lot of hogs. He raised a lot of hogs. And he put that half of that 40, including the creek to the east of the house, into a hog pasture. Woven wire around it and everything. So there was about 20 acres, including part of that creek, in that hog pasture. And then we had an alfalfa field just to the south of that. But then there was then to the west of the house was 80 acres in there. It went a half mile north and then a half a mile west and then a half a mile south again. No, quarter mile.
Well, there's a
Quarter
pasture
mile
over
west.
there. Part.
Yeah, and there was a pasture over there too.
Lots of big walnut trees on that
And
creek.
On the
on this
creek
immediate
down
place, there were a lot of big
Not
walnut
Not over
trees.
in that other one, but
I
we
see.
used to go in that creek that was across the road and over there, and they had a spring. You guys remember that spring?
Oh, wonderful
And we used to
spring.
go there and have picnics sometimes, and,
Yeah.
and we'd play as children in that spring because you could dig the sand around there. It was lots of fun.
Oh, we went over there, Bill and myself and Alvin Brandon. Bub Brandon come over and we'd go over there and man, get down through that creek. There's all sand and everything, and we'd build a dam down in there, and then we'd take off all of our clothes and skinny dip,
Yeah,
boy, and,
right.
and have a big
It's
time
cool.
playing in that sand.
And it seems like that one time you even caught frog legs, and Mom tried to cook us some frog legs. There were lots of frogs along
Yeah.
in the creek that was near
Yeah.
the house.
But anyway,
Martins were good at
Yeah, the
frog legs.
Martins taught us probably
Yeah.
about the frog legs. Because the Martins just lived down the road a little ways. Not very far.
Charlie Sear then went up to Franklin.
Yeah, that's where the Sear
Franklin
family
the
had
Sears.
been.
His dad lived up there, and so Charlie went up there, and Charlie built himself a new home up there just to the north of his dad's home. And his dad lived in a mansion.
Yeah,
I'll
so
tell
I
you
said
that.
they invited us up there once.
Boy,
showed
he
us
lived
all
in a
everything.
mansion of a home. Charlie built this new home, and the furniture in Charlie's new home and part of the woodwork was solid walnut.
Oh,
He got the walnut trees from the place down there, what we call the Sear place.
oh my goodness.
He came down there and they cut down walnut trees. And in fact, we helped him.
Well, he owned
And-
it during the time we were
Sure,
living there.
we
So it was
rented
just
it.
rental.
It's strictly
yeah, it was
rented.
just rental.
What
yeah.
was the house like?
Well, it's just like when you were there, Donna.
Pretty small.
Want us to describe it?
I'll let you.
Yeah.
Okay.
Hot
Yeah.
in the summer, cold in winter.
Yeah, the house was built there, and old Charlie, when he built that house, the attic part up over one of the south bedrooms, he had put a tank
Yeah,
up there
didn't
in the attic.
Lena mention that tank?
Yes.
He put a tank up there, and then there's a windmill out there about 50 feet on out from the northeast corner of that house, and that windmill, when it ran, would pump water up there into that tank. And so that's the way the water came down into the kitchen
So
quite
we
a
And in
bit.
the
Running
summer, you
water.
could have a warm bath
Yeah.
out of that.
Yeah.
Because it was warm.
But anyway, my dad then went in there, and he sunk a barrel out there by that well. He sunk a barrel down in there and pumped water out daily into that barrel. Fresh water was cool, and we always put our milk and butter and so forth in jars
Yeah.
down
Do you
in that
remember that
water
day
to
that
keep
we
it
had
cool.
I
That was your
remember that barrel.
refrigeration.
Yeah, and keep it
Dean
cool.
Lee remembers
Dean will
that.
tell
Yeah.
us a story.
Yeah, Dean, you tell
Dean
us
will
about
tell
Dean
us a
Lee.
story about the barrel now.
Well, see, the barrel, like Don said, it was in the ground. I remember the windmill well because I fell over backwards into the pit there at the windmill and cut my head. But the barrel that was sunken in the ground, Dee and Lee were born on the Sear place. And I'd say they were probably maybe 2 or 3 years old. And I was talking to Lauren one time, and he was telling me the same thing happened in your family. Dee fell head first into the barrel. They were dipping water out, and Lee grabbed Dee by the pants and held on, started hollering. And we ran over there, of course, and got him out. But that barrel was, it probably should have been dug out then because I remember Lauren telling me the same story about
That was
your
some of them
kids.
fell? Oh,
Yeah,
I
same
didn't
thing.
remember that.
And one of them grabbed the other one and held them until they could get them
Yeah,
out.
because it wasn't a very high ridge around the
No,
top.
it was,
You could
it was
fall
kinda
in.
dangerous.
But it was really important to have that cold water because we didn't have any refrigerator or anything.
No.
I should finish up now on the rooms to the house. The house was built there with, I guess, well, there was immediately to start with was 2 bedrooms on the south, and there was a dining room, living room on the north. And then there was a lean-to kitchen on the east, the south and the east, and then to the north of that kitchen was a large porch. Well, when Charlie built that porch, he put a concrete floor in that porch, and he built a drain in there. And there's a middle drain in there, and it ran clear out and down to the northeast there, and drained kind of down over that little bit of a grade there, you know. Okay, so then he went in then, and he put a bedroom on the west side.
Yeah, you added that.
Added a lean-to on the west side. And so Bill and I, and Dean, I guess, we slept in that middle south bedroom, and Evelyn had that
The west.
southwest corner bedroom, and Dad and Mother slept in that west bedroom, plus Dee and Lee. Dee and Lee slept in there too. And that's where Dee and Lee were born, of course, when we lived there on the Sear place.
Yes, when the twins were born, we were shocked. You know, we didn't know we were going to have twins in our family at all, and Mom didn't even know it. See, those days they
What
didn't.
year were they born?
1931.
Okay.
At the winter after we'd moved on to the Sear place, and Mom was never much. They were doctored at Talcott because I told you they started back when Dad had the cut jaw and all that. And so she would send her urine tests over by Dad, and she just wouldn't even go to the doctor. Of course, maybe he wouldn't have told her there were twins anyway. How do I know? But Aunt Addie came for the birth of the twins, and we had all been sent off to school. And when we came home in the afternoon, I remember coming in and Aunt Eddie being there and telling us to tiptoe, and she had on the dining room table 2 pillows. Here were these 2 babies.
Goodness.
Yeah. And you know, they were good-sized babies. Dee weighed 6.5 and Lee weighed 8 pounds.
But we about lost Dee, though.
Yeah.
Oh, is that right?
Dee was not.
Kind of frail, even though he weighed 6.5. And anyway, we were shocked to pieces. We didn't. In fact, they hadn't even talked too much about there being a baby.
And Dad was the most shocked.
Yeah, he was. He was really
he
upset.
didn't. He didn't know how he was going to handle it.
Yeah. Too much responsibility, maybe.
Yeah, a lot of responsibility.
Until he felt guilty afterwards and tried to treat Dee better because he had wished he didn't have Dee.
Oh, that's a normal reaction at those times.
So he felt so bad afterwards that he ever wished such a thing.
Oh.
Now, in that Sear place, there was the 40 acres on which the house was located. There was an 80 on the west. And then as you went south, there was a half section, rented a whole mile. A half a section of land laid in there. Now, this Sear place is located a mile east of Grandfather's place and a quarter mile north. That's where the property, the buildings are located. Crystal Creek School is located on another mile east. So you can see all that kind of area is concentrated. Now, Uncle Clarence and Aunt Lena lived on the Williams place, just about a half a mile directly east of the Sear place.
When we were living on
When we were living on the Sear place, while Uncle Clarence and Aunt Lena lived over there.
So you kids went to Crystal Creek.
We went to
School.
Crystal Creek
And that's
School.
where Dean started first grade,
Yeah,
isn't that
I
what you're
went to
right?
school in Crystal Creek, and of course.
Oh, Don too,
Nelda,
I guess you started there.
Kenneth and Nelda,
Yeah.
and of course our family. Then once in a while, Dale and Elda. Now, Elda was a little younger, but Dale.
Well, but
And,
he didn't go to school there. But
no,
you mean
no,
he,
but
we
what I
used
was
to,
saying, we were all in that.
Yeah.
Oh, let me tell you about going to school there. I started to school there, and in our second grade, why, I was in the second grade, and Phyllis Hawley was in the first grade. And so the teacher said, well, with only one in each class, she's going to move Phyllis into the second grade class there, so that we'd have 2 of us in the class. So that we did that, and she was a wild woman. Gillespie was her name. And old Kenneth.
I think I've told you about poor Kenneth going to school.
Boy, that teacher was a wild one. Man, she got me up there beside her desk, and I couldn't remember the word bar at a gate. And boy, she said, now you stand there, and she whacked me over the hands about 10 times. And she said, you stand there and say that over and over. I'm going to have the rest of the classes come up here and recite. And so, boy, I got to listening to the rest of the classes recite, and I forgot the word bar. And so, about that time, I thought, oh, man, what am I going to do? And, oh, boy, now, what's that word? And, boy, for some reason, God Almighty must have told me, but I remember bar.
She treated Kenneth like that.
Oh.
She was trying to teach him how to read. It was just terrible. Bang his head and say, C-A-T cat. Now you remember that.
Boy, she beat up on Kenneth.
Oh.
And Kenneth, we'd go by Kenneth's place,
Oh,
and he'd go to walk to school with us. And Kenneth, we'd tell his folks, I'm sick. I'm
Oh.
sick, I can't make it.
well, no wonder he's sick.
And Uncle Clarence and Aunt Lena, finally, they gave him some castor oil, because he was sick. And boy, I'll never forget, boy, my mother called over there to Uncle Clarence and Aunt Lena and says, I can agree with everything you're doing so far, but I don't think you better give him any more castor oil. And so, and that teacher had old Kenneth just scared to death.
Well, do you know I think I told, I don't know, maybe I told you that. But anyway, you know, we found out afterwards she was sickly because that teacher died.
Oh, my goodness.
Yes, she did. She died, and we had a whole rounds of substitute teachers then.
Oh, in
But
that
I
one
And
year?
that was, oh yes, and in the next year too, before they really got it settled. And it was during that time that your Aunt Ruth taught a little bit. But we just had first one and then another. Oh, it was just...
Man, after that, though, we had some good teachers.
Oh yes, and then we finally got settled. And
Oh,
had
we
some good
really
teachers.
had some good teachers. We had Florence Rumbaugh, her sister
Well, that little red-headed Evelyn Whitted was a good teacher.
She was
came
good.
in there
We had good
after
teachers.
that and was a good teacher.
Oh, was that the one that had the dad that had come up there
Yeah.
in bad storms, and her dad would come up
He
there?
would play. I've got to tell you this. She could play a mandolin and sing, and she tried to do good things for us. She had her dad play Santa Claus. Well, anyway, we had this Christmas program, and they invited all the parents and the mothers. I don't know if it was the daytime one. And we were waiting for Santa Claus to come, and we were waiting for Santa Claus to come, and we were waiting for Santa Claus to come, and he didn't come. So all at once she took out, Grandma was there too, and she took off working on our learning the Star Spangled Banner. Because I don't know if you know this or not, but that's when the Star Spangled Banner became our national anthem, was in that period of time.
Oh.
And she was having us learn the Star Spangled Banner when we were waiting for Santa Claus. Finally, Santa Claus came, and Grandma said, I was never so thankful for anything in my life. Whoever thought of singing the Star Spangled Banner when you're waiting for Santa Claus? Anyway, she was a good teacher, though. She kept things going, and she had a nice father.
Now I'll have to tell you I want to put one more thing in here. See, Evelyn, what time is it?
You're fine.
Evelyn graduated. See, from
From
Crystal
Evelyn
Creek.
Whitted, too.
And I'll tell you what. We used to have to go to Phillipsburg. Everybody graduated. Then you didn't graduate until you went to Phillipsburg and took a test.
Oh, yeah, you took county exams.
You took your county exams. And hey, that's when I realized that I had a smart sister.
Oh,
Because she came through that test down there with about, in the 5 high of the whole state.
oh, no, not state. It was a county.
County then.
That's wonderful.
But anyway,
you took after your mother.
Well,
High was second high,
oh,
wasn't it?
no, it wasn't. But I was in the top group.
Let
and
me
I
brag
never
on
will
you, Evelyn.
forget, I got to sit up on the platform at the graduation
Oh, man.
exercises at Phillipsburg. And they all got to come. And usually it was just the Phillipsburg scholars who got in the top ones. So I remember they're looking down their nose at me and wondered why I was sitting up there with them. I never will forget.
Man, I was proud as a peacock, I'll tell you that. And from then on, I knew I had a real smart
You had to respect
sister.
her, didn't
But
you?
I'll tell you one other thing. She got it from her mother.
Well,
I
I
think
was
so.
saying, I think
I
my
think
mother
so.
was a brilliant lady.
She got it from our mother.
I agree.
There's no question, man. That mother of ours was a smart woman. And she could teach school.
That's right.
And she could prepare lessons. I'll never forget seeing my mother prepare the lesson for the ladies' Sunday school classes. She would, on Saturday afternoon, about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, she started preparing and getting scripture and everything to go with the lesson. See, the church always had the references made.
Yeah.
And she always related that, and just a terrific teacher.
Dean, do you remember any of your first year? How many? Is it 2 years you went there before you
I
went
went to Crystal Creek for 2 years.
For 2 years.
But what year was that, Don, when we come home that night and you started the fire and got excited?
Tell about that, Dean.
Well, it must have been the middle of winter, but
Boy, it was.
Don and I come home from school, and
Folks were
the
going
folks
to
were gone, so Don, he thought he better build a fire in the kitchen stove. We had that big Monarch range. So he gets a bunch of corn cobs and sticks and stuff, starts the fire. It gets to perking pretty good. Pretty soon the top of the stove got red hot.
Red hot.
Just cherry red. Ooh, we got excited then, and Don did. I was standing back watching, of course. Of course, I kind of fidgeted maybe, but he said, he looked around and he said, Dean, Dean, he said, you pray and I'll put the fire out.
And we did.
And we got her out.
And we did. And the only reason we got it put out is because our parents ahead of time had prayed for us and everything, and believed that Almighty God would take care of us. I'll tell you that for sure.
Kids can be very...
But I tell you, I'll never forget, I'll see that top of that stove red from the day one. Boy, that thing was hot. So I took the lids off from right in there, and I took some water, and I poured over that fire and got her put out.
Sure.
We got her put out and cooled down. But I guess I must have said something to Dean. Dean, your prayers have been answered. We got the fire put out, and now we'll have to build a new fire.
Well, you know, while we were living down there, I started high school in Alma, and you know, Grandma had a sick spell. She had a stroke, and she was sick some of those years in there too. And I that you know fits all in there. That's when her sickness started. We're in the early 30s.
And that's when you stayed with Aunt Gladys?
Well, I was going to high school. I started high school in 1932. So see, it would have been the very
So you
next
went
year.
directly after your 8th grade graduation?
Yes, I did. And I stayed with Aunt Gladys, and I didn't even get home every weekend. My folks would furnish cream and eggs for Aunt Gladys, you know, and some meat, things like that. Because like Don was saying, we were entering the Depression then, and there wasn't money and so forth. So Aunt Gladys, I stayed with her, and then the folks tried to furnish food and so forth. So a lot of the things that went on back at home on the farm, I didn't always
weren't a part
know
of.
about all that.
Now, let me tell you one other thing, and I suppose the time's getting a little short, but anyway, 1928, 29, 30s, we had the Depression. All right, so we get up,
Yeah,
get up
that's
there,
what I'm
and
saying.
in about 1931, 32, we looks up in the sky, and boy, she's red. And I mean, that dust was pouring in from Texas and Oklahoma, the dust storms. So Evelyn was up at Aunt Gladys was going to high school. This was on a Friday evening, and Bill and Dean and Dad got in the car and were going to go up and bring Evelyn home. So I stayed with Mother, and they were going to go up and bring her home, and they got up to the Prairie Dog. They just got across the Prairie Dog, and the dust got so bad they couldn't see anymore. And so they ran into the ditch, didn't you, Dean?
Well, we got kind of off the side of the road.
And they got out of the car then and walked back to the house on the south side of the Prairie Dog on the west side. And if you recall, there was a big 2-story white house there and everything. So they spent the night there. We didn't know where they were. And so we were at home. And the next day then, Aunt Gladys called us and said that they had spent the night there and they were going to go ahead and get somebody to come out with a wrecker from Alma and pull the car in, and they'd clean the dust out of the engine and this, that, and the other, and so they finally did. But the dust storms, all right, following the dust storms, following the dust storms was the grasshoppers.
Yes, those are bad, hard years.
Stoller and all this time we're going through here, and it's kind of like a depression. And dry. My gosh, it was dry. You couldn't, even though you prayed for rain, God didn't answer the prayers. My goodness, it got dry. So my dad then got so disgusted about everything that in 1936 then the folks, it was my mother and dad and Martha Cockroft, Albert, a cousin's wife, and took her daughter, Maxine, and Dean and the twins, and they went to Colorado to Uncle Mutt's over at Delta to locate a place to move to.
Well, he had urged
Colorado.
them to do that earlier. He
You
had
could-
been by and visited.
You can
know.
see why.
Yes, he had urged them to do that. And so it was his influence, but they went to see about it.
But
Dean, what do you remember
Well,
about that
I
trip?
want to tell one more story about Don and Bill and Kenneth.
Oh, all
And
right.
of course, Uncle Clarence lived over the hill, you know, and Kenneth used to come over the hill and play with Bill and Don. He was a little older. They were a little older than I was, but I remember Kenneth was gone and Uncle Clarence was looking for him. And he come over the hill to find him. And Dad said, he said he's all right. He's out there with Bill and Don playing. And Uncle Clarence looked at him and kind of funny. He ran out the door. Kenneth, Kenneth, Kenneth.
there could be nothing worse.
Yes, because he said, well, that Bill and Don hurt my
Why, what do you think? He says he's all right with Bill and Don. He's going to get in trouble for sure.
Bad influence.
But we had good times together.
Right.
Yeah,
Well, we
yeah,
played
that's
together.
right.
We used to go up to Grandpa's. My dad would go over to Grandpa's and do blacksmith work. Granddad had a pretty good shop. Do blacksmith work. Well, at that same time, Kenneth and Bill and me, we'd find us some old wheels or something, and we'd make us a cart or something like that to go over there and go down those big hills. So we got this cart made up, and we couldn't find the buggy. We had the buggy axle, but we couldn't find the nuts to hold the wheels on the buggy axle. So we put 2 wheels on there, and we took this wire, and we took some pliers, and we just screwed that wire up just as tight as we could. And boy, we went out there from Granddad's place, and we got on this cart, and Bill was going to guide it, and Kenneth got on one side, and I got on the other by Bill, and this was 4-wheeler. And so here we go, down that first hill. Boy, we made that pretty good. So you go on down over a little bit of flat land there, about a 1/4 mile on west, and there's another big hill. And then the place on down was called the Hosies. Hosies lived down there. But anyway, we got to that second big hill. Man, we were going. We got about 3/4 the way down that hill, and the front wheels both came off at the same time. Man, I'll never forget, I just flew out there and dug my nose in the ground. I looked up at that, and man, there were those wheels just rolling on down the road.
So they weren't killed, is it?
Really?
I tell you, I can't believe it.
And you can see also why Uncle Clarence would get worried about it, because that is the kind of thing that went on.
Well,
Sure.
Bill used to drive it, and Don and Kenneth sat on each side.
One other thing I'd like to mention about the good times was that Uncle Glenn was kind of like an older brother plus an uncle. An
Yeah,
older
you're right,
brother
kind of a mix-up.
plus an uncle to us. And Uncle Glenn had 2 black horses, Duke and Prince. And they were a great team of horses. And I think Granddad had given him those horses when he got married. And so they had them on a hay rack, and we went over to the silo on the north, that north 80, and to get a load of silage.
Well, maybe that's when Uncle Glenn lived over there,
And
wasn't
Uncle Glenn lived there. Yeah. But anyway, we were coming back around this corral that I described there, and there's a big old walnut corner post on there, and the Duke and Prince would tend to cut that corner a little short. So there was Bill first on the right side, and then there was me, and then there was Kenneth, and then there was Dale Rumball sitting there with their legs hanging over the side. Well, the bloomin' horses turned there a little too quick and just turned right into that corner post, and so it drug us off. Oh. And we just spun with our legs hitting that corner post, and so we finally got in the house, and I'll never forget. My goodness, they called the different people, and here they came, and here's Uncle Glenn, of course. He'd been over there with us, and of course he felt like he had let the team turn too quick coming around that corner. And so I'll never forget how what a terrible event it was for us and the family, plus the Uncle Glenn and everybody involved. It was terrible.
It really did hurt their legs.
Sure.
Oh, it really did. I guess I could show you scars on my legs today, but that was kind of a terrible situation.
You know, I want to mention, oh, is it
I'm
over?
sorry, it's flashing.
All right.
All right.
I was just going to say,